For today's closing session, we're going to switch gears and move from politics to another cultural force that can stir an equal, if not greater, amount of passion around the world, and that is sports. Sports, of course, is inherently narrative, starring heroes and villains, telling stories of triumph over adversity, and watching the underdogs win the day. Joining us now are two gentlemen who have elevated the art of storytelling about sports, not only by exploring the stories behind the game, but recognizing the central role played by the fan. While Bill Simmons, Connor Schell, and their moderator Jason Hirschhorn take the stage, let's take a look at what we found in the Paley archives. Milton Berle with legendary sports writer Grantland Rice, who, as many of you know, is the namesake for Bill's website.
I went to see the Army and Navy game, and I was invited by one of the great, if not the all-time great sports writer, the dean of the sports writers, Mr. Grantland Rice. And he is really a magnificent man, knows so much about sports, it's really fabulous. I read his column every day in the New York Mirror.
Come in.
Hi, Granny.
Oh, hello, Mill.
How are
Glad
you?
to see you.
Oh, am I disturbing you? Really?
Not a bit. I'm certainly glad to have you here.
Mind if I
Sit
sit down? Gee, I'm glad. I really came over to thank you, Mr. Rice, for the very wonderful time I had at the football game.
Well, I'm going to tell you that you made a big hit in the press box. I'm awfully glad you came along, Mill.
Well, thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Connor Schell, Bill Simmons, and Jason Hirschhorn.
I've never seen a sports writer's desk that neat, frankly, ever.
I thought that looked kind of like Bill's podcast studio.
It did.
Oh, yes.
All comes around.
Your pictures are very neat. Well, this is truly a treat for me in that I'm really a huge fan of both of these guys and look to them to sort of set the narrative of how I consume sports, not only from documentaries, but really every platform now. And there really is no better thriller or drama or comedy, and frankly, sometimes sci-fi, than sports on a daily basis. And I really wanted to start with you guys. When I was growing up, I would listen to Howard Cosell, read a deli menu. Who were your inspirations in storytelling, and how has that affected, what you guys do in sports, whether it was a sportscaster or not?
You want to go?
You, that's you.
I grew up in Boston in the 70s, and we just happened to have one of the best sports sections ever. It was people like Peter Gammons and Will McDonough and Bob Ryan and Ray Fitzgerald, who was my first favorite columnist. So those were the guys that kind of shaped how I started thinking about sports from a big picture standpoint, but also we had really good teams, and it was just hard not to get swept up. And I wrote about this in my book, but my dad had season tickets for the Celtics. He got one season ticket when I was 4. We started going the first year they won the title. And in '75, the Red Sox made the World Series, and just things kind of broke my way for me to fall in love with sports. I was an only child. So it just kind of snowballed, and then eventually I became a weirdo who was obsessed with sports.
Sure. Connor, who influences you from a storytelling perspective?
From a storytelling perspective, I was going to go a different direction, because so much of what I love about what we get to do is obviously talk about sports, but put it in historical context. And so I've just sort of always loved nonfiction, right? And so those were always the books that I was always reading, historical novels, when I was doing things based on the truth. And
I'm actually the same way. I didn't read fiction at all.
And so, I think kind of putting together a love of sports with being able to explore kind of how, using sports to talk about culture is exactly what I would have sort of dreamed about being able to do.
And I was like
How was that for not giving you any names?
No, that was
I get it.
decent,
You
right?
didn't have to name names. I get the influence. That's right.
Sometimes there would be something great on, and it would really resonate with me. Like I remember, I think it was like the 25th anniversary of Wide World of Sports. So I was probably like 15 or 16, and they had this great special, and it ended with this like 10-minute Muhammad Ali thing. That was like a montage, and they brought him out, and he was just starting to kind of go. It was like his hand was trembling, but he was still in decent shape, but you could tell it was, kind of over for him as an athlete. And the piece that they did was just so great, and it ended with this Bob Dylan song. And that always stuck with me, like when we were thinking about what our thing would eventually look like. You always want to have moments, and I think the best thing about 30 for 30 is the best ones always seem to have a couple moments in them.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I for a living now, you know, curate content really from a sense of curiosity, and what 30 for 30 and Grantland does is really a holy grail for me. And you guys are, you know, specifically Grantland and what you do, you're on podcasts, you write, you know, long form journalism, you're on TV, you're doing web video. How do you pick where you're going to tell a story? You know, when we are in a multi-platform world, do you decide this is going to be podcast and that's going to be video and this is going to be written, or you know, what kind of decision making do you make on that?
So I guess that evolved because initially I was just a writer, and that was all I wanted to be. And then around 2007, I felt like I was really good at writing my column. Like it was just like it was about as good as I could do when I was really into a certain subject or whatever. And started thinking like, well, is this it? Am I just going to keep doing this and that's it for the next 10 years? And at the time, this podcast medium had started, and I thought I listened to one by Mark Stein, who works for us, and he interviewed Chad Ford, or Danny Ainge, and they talked about the Celtics. And it was cool. It was like this 20-minute interview. It was on demand. I was like, I want one of those. You know, it was like I was asking for, I don't know, like a CD or something. But so I got one, and it became this format that within 2 years, it seemed like there were some people that liked the podcast, but maybe didn't read my column, which was really weird to me because I always thought myself as a writer. And then as things evolve, you realize that the more things that you can kind of do, pieces of you are going to mean different things to different people. And I also think it's fun. I think challenges are fun. So like with 30 for 30, it was, the cool thing was just like, can we do this? There was a challenge of putting it together with a whole team, which was fun. But then on top of it, the way you got to tell a story was so different than anything that I did, that it was just, I remember that first night when the first one ran and there was like a playoff game against it, but it was so thrilling to actually watch all this work that we did kind of show up on TV. Different experience than writing.
Just to answer that question a little bit of a different way, I mean, it is incredible to be at a place like ESPN right now and to be able to think about story and say, okay, well, this is really interesting. Like, send it to Bill. Like, do you have a writer who wants to tackle this as a feature? Yeah. Or should we make a short film about this? Or can this be a documentary? Or maybe it's just the basis for, an interview Bill wants to do. To be able to, so like to have all those, weapons in your arsenal allows you to, because I think, when you thought about, when we first sort of started these things, when you think about stories in a very specific way. And so, like, some things don't make a great documentary, but that doesn't mean they're not interesting, right? They can be interesting in a totally different format. Yep. And it's why I really love what we've been able to do in the short form over the last couple years, because I think it opens up this whole different kind of story to tell, and sort of some different, you can take some different chances in those forms.
And it's also, before it was like doc or not a doc.
Yep.
And then once the shorts, as he said, like, now there's like 3 conversations. It's like sports movie, doc, or short. And you kind of know. Like, I think we've gotten really good at figuring out. Or Bill's assigning a writer to do an oral history.
Totally.
Right? I mean, it can go a lot of different ways.
I think you sum up some of the problems with, frankly, traditional media making the jump. If you look at newspaper publications or even traditional television stations, they had slots. Right. They filled the slot. And
not everything's meant to be told in 5 acts over 48 minutes, right?
Yet to some newspaper people, that was an article, and you had to do an article, and yet now, relatively late, really following ESPN. I mean, if I look back at my career at MTV or at Sling, I mean, ESPN was the first to jump on a lot of these new platforms, and you being given the ability to tell a story in any format it seems obvious, but I think that's been part of the problem of the transition of media.
But one of the things that when Bill and I first met and started talking about just sort of things like this, like one of the things that we kind of really found like immediate common ground on was the idea that if something's good, people will consume it, right? I mean, yep. I think, and at the time it was like, podcasts have to be 12 minutes, and
That was a note I got for a
pieces,
while.
people who
Podcast
go,
is too long. Make it shorter. It's like
people who
I'm
go
going
online
Never
will
breaking
only,
the
will
fourth
only
wall type
spend
stuff.
3 minutes, or I mean, it was like everybody was consumed with this idea that attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and so you have to have this sort of rapid fire of opinion and all these things, and so some of it is just like we're kind of, run counter by nature, but but also like our belief was really like if you tell something, a really good story, that can be a 3,000 word column, it can be a 110-minute movie, it could be a 70-minute podcast, like it's
I can tell you, I get notes
and they'll
every
consume
day.
it all the way, right? It's not.
Yeah, I mean, I get notes every day from Bills fans, from your fans, and even the last 30 for 30 short, one note I got was, I wish this was longer.
Right.
And, what was it, 15 minutes or something like that?
Well, one of the tricks that I think we've gotten pretty good at is you got to like figure out where the voids are and go there. And, you can't just assume, like if you're working on something, whatever project it is, or you're building something, you can't just assume that 2 years from now, the project's going to look like what you think it is right now. And I think with Grantland, like initially, it was a response in a lot of ways to where the internet was going, and people were like, it's got to be immediate, you got to put up 20 posts a day, things like that. And I'm thinking, well, I'm still writing these 6,000 word columns and people are reading them, so I don't know if this is right. So what if it's, a bunch of good writing here and we'll have some podcasts and that'll be the site. But now it's like you look at our site and we're doing shorts, we have a huge video channel, we're like creating original content. We're doing oral histories and all this stuff, and it's a much bigger site than I ever thought it would be.
Sure.
And I like it. Like I like that I was wrong about things.
Did you feel any insecurity? All of us had our first days in the business where, you think everyone wears a lab coat and they know more than you. And
Right.
you come in and you're like, well, how am I going to know what these guys know? And they give you the 12-minute cue, or, people aren't reading long form.
I never listen to any of that stuff. The one thing is, I got a couple good news. I'm really glad I did the site with ESPN, because I think if I had been on my own, I think I would have screwed up a couple things. But John Kozner, who runs internet
Sure.
for us, he gave me a great note, like pretty early on in the process, which was like, don't launch everything all at once. Like you want to add stuff, like start out smaller, add pieces, and you figure out what you need as you go. And that was the single best note I got. And we're still adding stuff. Like we're still, we added a TV show 2 months ago. I never thought we'd be on TV. But, you want to keep adding pieces and see what works and doesn't work.
Sure. When we met years ago, I think it was around when 30 for 30 was debuting. I think it was like close to the Tribeca Film Festival. And I remember my way of taking it in was these were 30 directors that had, some point of view on sports. If you have to sort of sum up, what the ethos is behind 30 for 30 now, I think it's changed a little. It's not through the view of just the directors. These are great stories. Like, if you have to sum up 30 for 30, what makes a 30 for 30 film?
An interesting, specific story, right? And I know that sounds like a very vague description, but I mean, I think we always start with the premise of is this interesting? And then, I always, how we kind of got to the types of stories we're doing in 30 for 30 is this notion of like, okay, so sports documentaries to us, and we both have this love of sort of nonfiction stories, and by the way, I should mention John Dahl and Libby Geist and Dan Silver and this whole team of great
We have a good
people
team, that helps.
we work with, but this idea that it was a very closed system, right? It was a very, people were telling historical stories in a certain way.
You mean HBO?
And well, I mean, but I also mean ESPN and other places at the time, right? It was, and they had a notion of history as like, it had to be black and white, and it had to be Ted Williams.
They played the two-key piano.
Yeah, and
they were for my dad. They weren't for me.
Yeah.
and
That
so,
when it was a game.
for what we wanted to do, like Len Bias was history, and Allen Iverson was history, and O.J. Simpson was history. So I think like the notion of the recent past is something that we were really attracted to, right? And then also, the idea that things sort of either seem to be issue-based or survey-based, right? And so it was like, and so we really thought about the idea of there's this huge void of people aren't doing sports storytelling that is story-based. And so like I remember watching something about, and I think HBO did it, I don't know, but it was about the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry. And it was the rivalry over 80 years, right? And it was like they got to this incredible 10 minutes about Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler. And
Which
it was
the
like,
documentary.
And it was like, well,
Yeah.
I could listen to 2 hours just about that. Like, why do we now have to go? And so our premise was like, we're going to find those moments, those stories, whether it's a rivalry, a cultural happening, or, and then just tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end.
I get the sense
And then
that there's
not have it, you know, and if people want to draw larger conclusions from it or themes, like let's give the audience a lot of credit that they can sort of decide what that's representative of.
You know, I look at those moments as big moments and important moments, and yet I feel like there's no evil network executive saying what the topics that will get ratings or any use of data on that. I mean, they truly are small and big stories, known and unknown.
But we know sometimes, like, a lot of it has to do with the schedule. Like, we knew the Randy Moss thing was going to be huge, but a lot of it had to do with there was no real sports on that thing. And people have a hunger to watch stuff. But the one thing you left out, though, is the passion part. Because
totally.
The first series, you know, we're learning what we're doing. We're taking meetings with people, and you want to grab names. And what we learned as the whole series went along was that sometimes you have somebody's name, but they're not actually doing the documentary, or like it's their cousin, or it's like they're, and you can figure out in the meeting. You can figure out in the meeting who actually has the passion for it, and that's what he's great at. And we've gotten to a point now where when somebody does a 30 for 30. It's got to come from them, and they have to have the passion for it. And the ones that work are the ones like Marquise just now, who did the Randy Moss thing. Like, he just threw himself into that for 2 months, and eventually the passion of it came out, and that's how it works.
And then, you know, we also try, and this comes a lot from what Bill, I think, solely has injected into sort of sports journalism, which is like, it's okay to have a point of view, right? It doesn't have to be, you know, right down the middle. Like, you can take the audience someplace if you have a thesis of how something happened. And so we really encourage and allow the directors to sort of put themselves into the story, to reveal their biases, to, you know, to really talk in
Steve James, that was like what was that, like the fifth one we did or something like that?
Yeah.
I think that's
the whole thing.
I mean, it's a perfect, you know, it's something I wanted to ask later, but I mean, I'm bringing it up now because you did. You know, Bill, you are someone that's on TV, you've got opinion, and you're all over the internet, and yet you've got alliances, and you're very transparent about them. And do you think that's something that more people that are reporting on sports, journalism in sports, or pundits should be more upfront about, you know, who their homers are?
Well, I think it's funny. I think everybody has alliances. I think people are I think I'm transparent about mine, and it's kind of become part of what I write about and all that stuff. But I think if you listen closely and you read people, everybody's got sources they protect. There's announcers who are always going to favor coaches or favor quarterbacks, or announcers that are going to go after referees, but you'll never hear them talk about a coach.
Yep.
So my thing is, like, it's happening everywhere I look in sports. So here are my favorite teams. Here's where I stand. I've written some of the meanest columns I ever wrote about the Celtics and about the Red Sox. So it's like, it's not like I'm sitting here like a cheerleader, but I think it's really weird to work in sports but not care about it. I don't understand that. Like Bob Ryan, I think he's almost 70 now, and he won Sports Writer of the Year 2 years ago. He's retired. He's still writing. He's still on Pardon the Interruption. He's still on all these things. He's still passionate. Like, he still cares, and it comes out in what he does. And I think that's why he's still ticking.
That's why I look at storytelling. I mean, I don't want to get into the salacious aspects or gossipy aspects, but obviously, you know, recently with your comments on Roger Goodell and the issues that happened with ESPN, I took a stance of like, that's why I listen to Bill Simmons. That's why I watch Bill Simmons. That's why I trust him, because he's always, you know, sort of saying what's on his mind. I guess my question is, when you're a storyteller, how could you not be that way? And what would a company like ESPN be thinking? I mean, it's one of these situations. Where's the ESPN PR person here? Go sit in the back.
He's back there.
Yeah, all right. Duck down. My question is that, you know, you can't do a deal with someone and say, Bill, we love you. We want you to, you know, voice your opinions and then edit what you have to say. That's why we watch and we listen. And when I read the Ombudsman column on ESPN, and someone said that you were the franchise player of ESPN, and yet not one of the leading journalists. And I want to know, what do you see yourself as? I just see yourself as honest, and therefore I trust you in all sorts of different areas.
Well, thank you. You know, I don't know what I see. My thing is, I'm not sure it matters what people are, and I think that's a really antiquated way to think about it.
Yep.
I don't think people are. First of all, the word journalist, like, what does that even mean anymore?
Yeah.
You know, I
It's
think
like the word curator.
Yeah, like Don Van Natta is a journalist, you know, and that's somebody that won a Pulitzer Prize, and he wrote the Great Goodell story on September 19th that ended up shaping a lot of my opinions about Roger Goodell. I'm paid to have an opinion. I'm paid to educate myself with whatever's going on, come up with an opinion, and then write about it or talk about it creatively. And, you know, apparently we had a disagreement about whether I did that correctly, but I still think that's my job. And I think that, you know, when I was growing up, there was this whole old school theory, yeah, you can't have an opinion unless you go into the locker room. That was something I heard when I launched my site in the mid-late 90s. My opinion didn't matter because I wasn't talking to these guys. Well, at the same time, there's 24-hour sports radio stations. Those guys aren't going in the locker room. I think it's, if you're educated and you think out what you're talking about and you're entertaining, I don't really think it matters what position you're in or who you are or what your label is. I think it's like, do people like reading you and listen to you or not?
Yeah. The reason I bring it up is because I worry, given how progressive ESPN has been, the same issues that I brought about newspapers and whatnot. Anyone has a publish button these days.
Right.
And I can tell you from my standpoint,
I think I saw this morning that like 2 kids broke a story about a baseball player signing somewhere on Twitter. Like, it wasn't even, you know.
I love that stuff, and I love the fact that I would have someone who works in a company or someone who's just a fan sitting next to a David Carr or a Chuck Klosterman or anybody in a lineup of stories. And I agree with you that the labels are not helpful, and I don't really even know what a journalist is versus, you know, someone who has an opinion.
Well, we've had that issue with 30 for 30 too sometimes, right? With trying to figure out where the lines are for us telling a story.
Well, I mean, I don't like because people have talked about sort of, oh, 30 for 30 is occasionally great journalism, but that's never anything we sort of set
I never
out.
called it that. It's great stories.
No, I
Right.
know. I mean, we've never set out to sort of talk about it that way. I mean, our notion has always been like, if something's a great story, like it could have been told before. You don't necessarily have to bring something new to it simply by putting it all together and coming up with your own narrative thread or a different style. Like that can be a new presentation of something that may be known before. I mean, Bill mentioned the Randy Moss documentary, which was just the last one on, and I think it's a really good example of what we do because it was this perfect mix of an incredibly public figure who had this event that happened in his life, or this little small time period in his life that had been out there, but he had never really talked about it, and
people had their own perception of what happened, but
people hadn't really paid attention to it because it had happened before they knew who he was. And so I was really happy with how that film ended up, because it was something that if you had no idea who Randy Moss was, if you weren't a sports fan, you could watch that and enjoy it just as a story. Beginning, middle, end, you understood. But if you were a diehard sports fan who knew everything about Randy Moss and had followed his career, you now had this incredible context to everything you thought you knew about him. And so it had that sort of dual layer of importance to really accessible to you were talking about a new audience, but then also appealing to people who.
So let's jump on that. I mean,
those are our favorite ones, by the way. If you take a story that people thought they had their done opinion on, and then you twist it, and they're like, now I feel this way. Like, that's the best.
Right.
That's what it's all about. So I'm a sports fan, but I'm not a fanatic. You know, I think my era, ended with Reggie Jackson and Willie Randolph probably, and if the seats are good, frankly.
Right.
And how do you guys are accessible to the rabid sports fan and the person that's just coming in for a story or a fly-by-nighter during, a big series or some event, and yet your storytelling, both on Grantland, frankly, and on 30 for 30, seem to transcend the experts or the novices. How do you think about that on a daily basis? How can you tell a story in both ways?
So I think I kind of go back to that just test of something interesting, right? And our assumption is always, if it's really truly interesting to us, meaning we have the conversation and you walk out of the meeting and you want to go tell someone else the story that you just discovered or talked about, and if you think you can tell it well visually in the format, then you hope that that'll come to life and appeal to other people. But we're also like we have the privilege of being part of ESPN, which has this whole news organization that is covering things every single day. So we don't have to do anything, right? I mean, it's like if our stuff doesn't sort of meet that template of can we do this really well? Is it going to hold people's interest? Is it talking about the culture in some way where sports is really just sort of your window in? Then we just don't have to do it. And ESPN will be just fine without
I think what's
another 30
fantastic
for 30
about
on,
both,
right?
and I'm sure, it's sort of to further the point, is that, on the internet, for example, something new or something old is new to somebody.
Right.
And when I look at Grantland and I see the 40th anniversary of SNL and all the pieces there, or looking at movies in a way that aren't just current, or looking at 30 for 30 and watching some of the stories that are years and years old, Hillsborough and others. Those are new to me in many ways, and I love that it's anti-nature of sort of the stream-based mentality of breaking news and everything that's going on in the moment.
Well, one thing for like Grantland and definitely 30 for 30 and just my column that's really worked is I still care about sports and I still care about all this stuff. And like I interviewed Lorne Michaels in his office this week for a podcast, and
which everybody here needs to listen.
Thank you for the plug.
It should be in the Paley Center.
It was just thrilling, and I think the one thing people always underestimate is the audience knows, and the audience knows if you don't care anymore. And there's been writers that I used to really like that you could kind of tell when they checked out, And I think that could be the case for a website. That could be a case for a documentary series. I thought HBO checked out in the middle of last decade with their documentaries. They were just putting up, done the same type of way about people that mattered 40 years ago, and they left a void for us to take.
Sure.
So
with the Bartles and James voice narrative.
And I mean, I think one of the things that I don't want to speak for Grantland, but I think you've done this on Grantland, and we certainly have tried to do with ESPN Films is storytelling in sports was a very closed system, right? It was sort of there's because traditionally you had to have media rights to there were 4 or 5 networks doing this, right? And there were sort of people there wasn't this big tent of okay, there's all these different types of people from all these different backgrounds who care about different things and think about things differently, telling stories, right? And so that was the premise of like there is sports evokes passion, I think, in our society now, like nothing else. Like I think music maybe, but sports fans come from all walks of life, and they're passionate about different things. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do is find new voices and give those voices access to an infrastructure and a platform.
Sure.
And by the way, those new voices could be Barry Levinson, who's never told a sports story before. It doesn't necessarily need to be a 23-year-old kid who's shooting a film on an iPhone, but we love that too, right?
And it's funny, the thing that we never expected, and this goes back to being lucky and thinking one thing and then you get lucky. We never thought people would rewatch the 30 for 30s like this. We've rerun how many times have we run the Fab Five one?
A lot.
60?
I
And
told
it still gets a
we
rating.
never- we never thought ESPN
people are
would launch
watching
this
it
many
I told
12
Connor
times.
5 people have bought me the box set already.
Yeah. But that goes back to the passion thing. It's like sports fans, they'll watch these like they would watch an old game on ESPN Classic or something.
I've watched Broke probably 20 times. I know we're running a little over, but this is Bill Simmons and Connor Schell, so I'm sure you don't mind, right? Yeah?
Thank you.
One question about passion, and then we'll run to Q&A. Passion of sports is brought into the fan. Part of these stories are the bad guy and the good guy. And we've seen these, narratives off the field and on the field. And, often sportscasters, take a stance on whether someone's a bad person or a good person. And how much of that do you think about in your storytelling? Like, is it the old, sort of There has to be the protagonist and the evil guy, and that's the way I think a lot of what I've seen in sports recently. I was watching this documentary around the NCAA and whether they should pay athletes, and Arian Foster was saying, the way they talk about a kid for taking a couple of dollars, that he didn't do anything illegal, is as if he was a criminal or a bad guy or a selfish guy. How much does the bad and the good guy play into what you guys report on a daily basis, or the narratives that you talk about?
I think our premise is always like the one thing we can promise is that we'll be honest and authentic, right? And so, the reality is that as you know, most people, particularly in sports, they're not good or bad, right? There's somewhere in between. And so I think, in the sort of nature of long form, it allows us to really explore, and hopefully as the series is going, more and more people are willing to talk to us and open up, because we have that track record of we'll sort of give this platform and really tell people what happened, which gives them this much greater understanding of, humanity, right? It's not
that simple. It's not as simple as that.
Well, for documentaries, it's a little more simple, but I think for writing, especially like writing a sports column or covering stuff day to day on Grantland, it's better when you have people that kind of fall closer to the villain side and the hero side of stuff, and I think that's why people have been so fascinated by the Peterson story and the Rice stories, because you look around and it's like, well, there really aren't any good guys in this. And you have Ray Rice, who's suspended for 2 games and then resuspended with evidence that doesn't seem to be new. So now it's like, well, Ray Rice isn't a victim. He's a bad person. He knocked out his fiance in an elevator. But at the same time, he has a right to work, and they already decided the punishment. So what's going on here? And I think that's why people were so interested and compelled by that story. It had the domestic violence thing, obviously, but just in general, I think when you have these big sports leagues that make tons of money, and you have, events or moments that people can relate to in real life, and they kind of cross paths and money's at stake, becomes really interesting.
I agree. Questions?
Yes. Oh.
Joe, right here.
Hey, absolutely love 30 for 30s. So you brought up the fact that you touched on a lot of recent history, like Allen Iverson and so forth. It seems like there's a lot of things in sports today, like very current topics that could use great storytelling and kind of that documentary exploration, like a lot of filmmakers are doing in different countries and in the U.S. Do you guys ever think about doing documentaries based on kind of current events, whether it be the Ray Rice thing or the culture of homosexuality in football, professional football, things like that, and exploring it in a current format?
So, I think our general premise, and I go back to the idea of being part of ESPN, which is this news organization that is exploring those ideas in various forms every single day. We tend to tell stories that are complete, right? We tend to tell stories where you have the real, within 30 for 30, where you have the real ability to put context and to make some connections that maybe in the moment are missing.
Because
right?
also it's going to live on for 30 years.
Right.
You don't want to, the story's not done yet.
One of the things that I'm sort of proudest of within this series is we've been doing these for 5 years now, and I think some of the stuff we premiered in 2009, we could put on the air tomorrow and someone can experience as if it's new, because it is made in such a timeless way. We were talking about the 2 Escobars.
One of my favorites ever.
Which we premiered in 2010, and then we put it back on around the World Cup this year, and people experienced it all over for the first time, and it was as if it was a new project. So, I totally get what you're saying. It's not what we do within this series. We don't make verite films sort of by nature, and we also don't make issue-based films. Our premise has always been, we get at issues by telling complete stories.
Well, and also there's other parts of the company that can tackle that stuff. And we have E60, which would, but I think Tiger is a good example. We had an idea that we're executing right now for Tiger that that story is not done yet, but there's enough of the story done that I think we could do something really cool with it. But at the same time, like, that guy could win 4 more Masters, and now that story shifts in another direction. So you never know.
So much of what you do is accessible to the non-sports fan. It's just good storytelling. How conscious are you of somebody who's not necessarily familiar with the topic when you're outlining it, filming, shooting, scripting?
Ooh, that's a good question.
So I mean, I think we're completely. I mean, like what you were sort of getting at before. Like, you know, we think about projects in sort of. You know, we stumbled on a lot of things in sort of how 30 for 30 was originally shaped and how it's kind of been ongoing. But one of them is this idea of it was a collection, and we were thinking about a whole slate. So we were trying inherently to think about this incredible variety of, well, we get 30 swings at this, so how do we want them to all relate to each other? And you know, how many sort of Bo Jackson films we want to do, which are sort of this kind of big, broad, sports-centric thing, and then how many stories do we want to do which are much smaller and have really incredible cultural resonance, but aren't necessarily you know, as ratings friendly, and so, you know, when we think a lot about, but the idea is if you tell something complete and you tell it well, it almost doesn't matter the level of sports fan you are, because people will just get different things out of it.
Grantland's different, because Grantland, you can't dumb it down ever. You can't do it with a website. Websites, the people are too smart, and you almost have to shoot higher than the norm and make people want to catch up with what you're writing. I mean, we've certainly done it with basketball. Like, we use all the advanced metrics, and we're totally over the top with the way we write about it and cover it, and it's like either catch up with us or sorry.
I wasn't suggesting dumbing anything down. Like
No.
But it's an important point, because I you know, like
I'm not dumbing it down an 11,000 word essay.
No, you're just telling a story.
But it's also, I just feel like.
I didn't say you were dumbing it down.
No, it's okay. I just want to defend myself for a second.
Connor just had a high school moment.
Forget it.
No, I just think 30 for 30, you're trying to hit as many people as possible.
But I also think like a whole premise of it is like, let's give the audience an incredible amount of credit that we don't need to hit them over the head with all these things that happened before we're talking about or after, right? We're just going to do this, and then you can, you know, as a viewer, can extrapolate what it means, right? And I mean, I think we hit. I say we don't do issue films. We hit some really serious issues. At its core, we're talking about race. We're talking about, you know, all sorts of things within our culture, but we're just trying to do it through very specific prisms.
I think that's a very important point, because as you've seen some of these big issues, whether it be steroids or domestic violence, they've happened in sports. Sports is magnifying them to be captured on a more global and national level. And if you really go back into the archives of 30 for 30, there isn't one film that doesn't touch on something there. It's just not, it's not the poster boy for it. It's told in a very human way. Questions?
We haven't done the right HGH one yet, though, have we?
I'm sure it's coming.
It's coming. It'll happen.
It won't be HGH, the real story.
As teams move to kind of continue to monetize and kind of keep their rights in-house, you look at what the Lakers are doing, MSG's done it forever, and the Dodgers. How do you see them as competition? I mean, the Dodgers probably have the best storyteller of all time in Vince Scully.
Well, define competition.
Within creation of the content, because they own all these archives of content.
We're always like, the more the merrier. Like, I feel like if something's good, people are going to find it. And if there's 7 things that are good, people are going to find it. And also, I like watching stuff. So, you know, the Lakers channel is actually really good. Mm-hmm. They have some good, I like the cheerleader show. It's good, it's compelling.
Not the basketball.
They'll show old games. Like, it's a really well done channel. And if they did an awesome 4-part documentary about, I don't know, the 80s
Jerry
Lakers
Buss.
or Jerry Buss, like, I wouldn't be like, damn, they did it and we didn't. We're always gonna have, we have so many ideas for more things, like, we're never gonna run out of ideas.
Right.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you see Howard Stern, you see Glenn Beck. You know, lots of people are going direct to the audience. ESPN's a wonderful home, but you're a really talented guy, Connor. You're a wonderful storyteller, Bill. Like, what do you need ESPN for? Why don't you go on your own and make a big load of money? Now.
Well, ESPN's been a great place to work for a long time, and you know, it's a good question. I mean, that's a bigger, more general question of just where everything's going. Like, I think at some point, people are gonna figure out how to go directly to consumers, and yeah, I think ESPN's in that situation with cable and satellite. Just think about how much has changed in the last 5 years. Like, I'm designing Grantland. I have no idea the iPad's coming. Like, I literally have no idea. And now I'm reading everything on my iPad. And I think anyone who thinks they know what TV is going to look like and what content and websites are going to look like, I think there's no way to predict what's coming. And, you know, the middlemen, I think, should be a little concerned.
I know when Bill went through his...
But that said, I mean, there is this sort of unique...
Oh, my Lord, what a save.
No, I mean, because ESPN holds this unique place in the culture.
Well, ESPN's never going anywhere.
Where sports fans congregate, right? So the idea that we can make a short film and we can say, okay, great, this is going to be on Grantland and ESPN.com, and we're going to reach all of these educated sports fans. They're going to come to one place and find this and not have to think about putting something on, you know, YouTube or some site and hoping that there's this level of discovery. As a content creator is like this, you know, incredibly freeing.
Well, you never hear about that. When you hear about everybody going direct, it's about having their own voice and not being, you know, neutered. And yet, you know, listen, a storyteller wants to find the biggest audience possible as long as it doesn't augment their story.
Well, I said before, like, I think I would have failed with Grantland if it wasn't for ESPN. And I also don't think ESPN gets enough credit as a company for trying 30 for 30 in Grantland, because it's not like it was like $10 to do either thing. Sure. And, you know, I think if you look at some of the competitors that we've had as a company, you know, remember like last summer, everybody made a big deal about Fox Sports 1.
Sure.
And they were going to directly challenge ESPN. Yeah. They can't even challenge ESPN 2. So.
Nor the Ocho.
I mean, yeah. I mean, seriously, like ESPN's a monolith. It's gonna keep cranking. And I think what's really interesting is what's happened with our website. And you've seen sites like Yahoo and CBS and SI.com. They're going one way and we're going the other way. And it's like we're kind of just gaining traffic as the other sites are stripping themselves down. And I think if you're thinking about ESPN long-term from a content place and just in general, like I think the website is the most interesting thing.
And you know, the other point I'll make is when we started 30 for 30, the people we were talking to were, to direct these films were primarily independent filmmakers, right?
We couldn't get any
so the idea for the independent film community to be supported by a platform like that, and to not have to worry about going to a film festival and trying to find distribution for all these things is also like something that is, you know, it's not common.
Sure. I know we got to wrap up. I've got my one quick last question, my only geeky sports question here, but the concept of relegation, where, you know, the bottom teams fall out of a league and ultimately others get into the league, something that happens in the Premier League and other places. You ever see that happening in U.S. sports that would add to the really fantastic storytelling?
It's such a cool concept. I always thought it would have been great for basketball. And you take a team like the Sixers, which is just disgracing the sport and life. They're just horrible. But yeah, it's smart what they're doing because they're gaining lottery picks every year. They're in the top 5 or top 6. They're doing the right thing, but they're also bastardizing basketball. And if you had relegation, all of a sudden they wouldn't be able to do that. And it would be cool and it would be fun to watch them just play this D-League schedule as they just kind of mope their way through it, trying to get back. I wish we had it, but I think it's too late. I don't see it.
Cool. Well, listen, thank you everyone for coming. Connor Schell and Bill Simmons.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.